Hello everyone, today we talk about the 100 Years' War. This is, I think, the very first video, paradoxically, after more than 700, mostly about medieval history, in which we address the world conflict, aside from the actually major three wars that the 100 Years' War actually was. Aside maybe from a video on the Battle of Formigny, that was just a tactical explanation of the battle. The reason why we'd never discussed the 100 Years' War before is, as usual, my random topic choice that, really goes at its own way. And statistically, we'll have naturally to come back talking a lot about this. Today, we will try to cover in a very sketchy, general, superficial, whatever way, this event. Let's put it in this way, not to categorize it, further. That really engulfed essentially most of Western Europe for, in fact, actually more than 100 years, and that triggered some of the single most important changes, in fact, in Western history. And this is exactly what we're trying to focus in. I mean, realizing what was the impact of the clash between the Kingdom of France and the Kingdom of England. If, by the way, if we can really talk about it in this term, the war in this terms, because namely it was just a dynastic conflict bringing to this series of wars, but eventually, it became, especially towards the end, something more, the intensity of the war itself increased, and these two systems began to take shape, right, and to, build up on the same contraposition between the two systems. We can see two countries, two, proto-nations emerging in this phase as two national monarchies taking a unitary shape compared to the previous times where, that was theoretically national intent, right? The Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, and even their intersections had, been outlined fundamentally in a kind of a English-French contraposition. Doesn't matter whether, of course, the English kings spoke French. The French was the language of trade in Britain, etc. So, but aside from this, there is evidently something more that builds up to actually two very different systems. There is an important asymmetry, politically and socially speaking, between France and England, right? France is a giant, England not so much. And the outcome of the war that sees indeed a French victory here is to be reflected upon as a, not just because the most obvious developments of the French state that this started, even before the 100 Years' War, as much as the English one. Actually, we must say here that this is exactly the point, that the Kingdom of England managed to inflict France certain blows during this war and to remain standing on its own feet in turn, right, in a situation that was highly unfavorable to it. I mean, France was the toughest system, was the strongest. England was smaller, had less resources, but it was more compact at a certain level. And even in here, this is not to be, given for granted, because it's exactly what happens in here, especially since the time of the reign of Edward III, that begins the same 100 Years' War and goes on for a consistent amount of time. For decades, and it as a fundamentally unitary direction that managed to, through the military victories, at giving further strength and unity to the Kingdom of England. It might have actually not evolved like in that way. That the 100 Years' War are connected. We talked first of all. We made some videos already about the political institutional profiles both of England and France at this time, especially for probably the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, so actually covering most of the 100 Years' War period. And maybe we haven't talked excessively about the before, but the Plantagenet Valois rivalry that takes place during the 100 Years' War is something that dates back, as for very far back in time, right? The histories of France and England are, closely intertwined one to the other since at least the 11th century, when the English kingdom, in fact, was conquered in 1066 by the Duke of Normandy, William. And from there on, the two kingdoms were characterized, aside from the strictly political, and point of view and dynastic questions, but probably by a broader commixtion of aristocracies, this thick intertwinement of interests, of languages, of ideas, right? This is evident even before 1066, right? After all, what William the Conqueror went conquering Anglo-Saxon England, for Anglo-Danish, let's say better by that point, England for, right? And what they were doing there. So the thing goes back even further in time, but it would be interesting to date it back to the very, even up to the migration era, because what was created in these two countries were effectively kingdoms, right? That had, once again, two very different transformations, to very different characters, right, since the beginning, but they also shared a lot in common. Even just if we take this area of, this Atlantic area, fundamentally, of Western Europe, right, the great basins of the Loire River and of the Seine. Think about the Ile-de-France in its connection to the channel, to the great agricultural resources, to trade, to, of course, something that spanned, far beyond that, right, even to southern France, in another reality, another nation, if you want. But England is open in the same way, the Thames, with, the same islander position, to this broader, just facing France per se, and think, as we will see now, how the wool trade, the Champagne fairs, the connection with Flanders here was an enormous deal with, and William the Conqueror was a Western Frankish leader, right? No more nor less, right? It literally doesn't matter by the slightest the fact that he descended from the Northmen back in the day, the Normans that invade Anglo-Saxon England and defeated Harold Godwin's son at Battle Hastings are Western Franks by language, by political, social, and military structures, by culture, by mindset, completely, right? And what rules in Anglo-Saxon England is a Western Frankish. That is, the Frankish world encompasses England. This is very important. I know that maybe, I don't know, many of you are disagree, because maybe they want to stress more the the isolated nature of Britain and the English kingdom more narrowly, to say, okay, we were something different. Yes, this is true, and this is true for every country, of course, but this broader Frankish dimension that encompasses Western Europe, essentially from Carolingian times onwards, this major chunk of Western Francia, Eastern Francia, central and northern Italy, eventually part of the north of the Iberian Peninsula, right, and expands far and wide in 1066, crosses the Channel and seizes England. That becomes part of that. In a Europe where the French model was taking over everywhere, keeping to take over basically everywhere for centuries as well, right? Even far in the east of Europe in some ways. This perspective is very important to understand. Really, it's a complement to the same English in many ways, because this system proved since its foundation, it's a refoundation, we could say, after 1066. It was one of the single most brutal chapters, by the way, in medieval history. Like the Norman conquest of England was traumatic, right? It wasn't like, I don't know, the Norman conquest of southern Italy or something. It was much softer. But what the Normans did in Britain was reshaping, really, sometimes taking, destroying to the bottom, sometimes maintaining, of course, a lot of the pre-existing Anglo-Saxon administrative traditions that were, by the way, some of the most advanced in the second half in Europe by the second half of the 11th century, and therefore shaping a kingdom proper, that, in fact, like all the other Norman holdings, even the Kingdom of Sicily in that regard, are very interesting to compare, because these were the single most centralized kingdoms in the history of high medieval Europe, right? Whereas the Western Frankish kingdom, from which France would fundamentally emerge, was engulfed in its own, creation. The vassalitic beneficiary system at the time of the conquest of England, by the Normans, the Ile-de-France was basically the only area was controlled by Western Frankish kings. Even in here, we should open a huge parenthesis, that is, what is the meaning of kingship and of monarchy in this context, and how it had evolved. We can't make all the story, because otherwise we would be talking about all but the 100 Years' War today. But it's obvious that the second half of the 12th century, and especially the beginning of the 13th, represent a watershed, right, that passes through the Battle of Bouvines that we described recently, some week ago, from a tactical point of view, and of which we, however, couldn't avoid to point out the extraordinary importance in the history of the entire globe. Like at Bouvines, there was, if you want, a modest battle, right, tactically speaking, wasn't this huge deal. But that was the single most important, world history changing event in the world medieval history, right? The world history of mankind happened in medieval times. The other concurrent, actually, were more or less the same level, is Constantinople 717, 718. That was an enormous deal as well, and it basically compares. But for Western Europe, this was without shadow of doubt, the single most important event, right? Because this triggered fundamentally the rise of the Capetian house in what now became properly France, right, under Philip II Augustus, dominance over France proper, right, and expanding during the 13th century towards the south, accessing the Mediterranean, compacting the territories, and especially taking away, as we've seen, of course, this connection that a great part, at least, of the connection that had tied the Dukes of Normandy as kingdoms of, that were also kingdoms of England, to their own to their own king in France, right? At the point in which, as you know, at some point they had, thanks to Eleanor's of Aquitaine's inheritance, the Plantagenets had even more land and power in France than the same French kings. Well, what happened at Bouvines is literally, the thing is flipped, right? Philip II had already seized Normandy, other lands from the English, but fundamentally at Bouvines, the tides could be reversed, and it did not happen, right? The Kingdom of France consolidates as fundamentally the single most important reality in Europe at that time. Like, as we have seen before, even just from terms of political, institutional, administrative, artistical, architectural, literally, philosophical point of view, France dominates Western Europe, or its Frankish culture, its emanation. Naturally, France is very diverse in this regard, because not only, the north of the Languedoc is something different from the Languedoc in the south, but the same north of France at this point wasn't much of a, of a unity. The same Plantagenets fundamentally had never been bothered much by the same French kings up to a certain point to recognize their status, because they were a few hundreds of kilometers away, but the French crown was not strong enough to require that. What happens in England as a direct consequence of the battle of the defeat of the English at Bouvines is, as you perfectly know, the Magna Carta. Not much the Magna Carta were are important constitutions later on in the 13th century were actually even more important than the Magna Carta, that, however, altogether change dramatically, unbalanced dramatically. Let's put it in this way: the institutional mechanism of the same kingdom, for which fundamentally the parliament rises as a major checker and balancer, we can say, of the of the same monarchy, that therefore cannot develop in the same autocratic fashion that France had, right, and would maintain, right, that it owned since a much longer time, even the same England, right. England developed quite early, for example, the concept of chancery, of capital. Like London is properly a more properly and more older capital than Paris, no doubt. But that's a matter of more, different, political cultures. But indeed, the power, the authority, the mystics that the French king possessed. We can say even before the properly, since the time of Clovis in a way or another. Of course, a lot of water passed under the bridges before, getting to our point. From there is not a linear process, but there is definitely a much more accepting attitude of the French communities towards their own king that there is not in England. Not to say that these people felt necessarily more French than what the English felt as themselves as English. Maybe it's actually the other way around, because France came to encompass as a northern French nation, essentially other nations in Gaul, in what we call France today, but because essentially this islet of the Ile-de-France is swallowing the others, right? But still, it managed to keep it, whereas England is much more evidently compact from a national point of view. It's smaller, right? It's more easily enucleated. It occupies most of the island as such, at least in division with Scotland in the north. But even just demographically speaking, economically speaking, it manages to expand, to consolidate as an entity. Wales is integrated, as you know. These are all things but France, maybe exactly for this reason, manages to create political institutional systems that is capable of keeping together on the long run much larger and much more diverse chunks of land and communities that inhabited in France. That, as you know, is instead a very diverse, a huge, first of all, territory by itself. It's split. There are mountains, there are major chains, major rivers, and even by a certain dimension, especially in the eastern frontier, there is not much of a clarity where the thing begins and it ends. But that's another topic. But it has to do with also the 100 Years' War, because think about Flanders, right? Those are considered historically to emerge eventually, especially and under this time, under the Dukes of Burgundy, they were actually the same Valois, right? Same branch of the same French ruling dynasty, right? That however, the Burgundian administration acquired seemingly through an homogenization of the local governmental practices, a more properly national identity, right? And that will emerge later on, against the Habsburgs, as you know. And that, however, started in many ways, probably as the major factor in relative terms, the same 100 Years' War, based on this ambiguity of being not much the fact that it's somewhat spanned across the same kingdom of France, mostly the county of Flanders, but also in parts of the Holy Roman Imperial lands, but the fact that they had interests in common with the English, mostly for trade reasons. Not that they liked or thought particularly much, high of each other, respectively, as often allies don't, in fact. But because they wanted to escape fundamentally the centralizing and expansive role of the French monarchy. Right at the beginning of the 14th century, when the 100 Years' War began, the French monarchy is a monster. It's an empire. It's properly, it's not a kingdom, right? It's the royaume, of course, by definition, but it's still something more. It has essentially an expansionistic policy. It's looking at it has looked at Aragon before. It's looked at other areas, but now it's looking at the Flanders that are rich, politically fragmented, basically next door to France, and technically part institutionally of the French kingdom, so that they're technically subjects, right? And they're been doing a bit on their own. They revolted at the very beginning of the century, and therefore there is an involvement that triggers the same, English participation in part. That, however, is connected to much to many other factors. In fact, the strengthening of the monarchical powers in France rendered always less acceptable the persistence of various interests and rights of the English sovereigns within the French kingdom itself, right? And this situation exploded dramatically in 1328, when the King of France, Charles IV, died without leaving direct heirs, right, nor brothers nor male sons, and the closer male relative was in fact his nephew, Edward III of England, who, reclaimed his right of succession in virtue of his, familial ties with the past king. So his claims, however, were not even taken seriously, right? Nor by the French, not by the same English, actually, not by themselves. Like, this was just a claim, as many others that were happening all over Europe in this regard. But even at the moment, the idea of fighting was not directly on the table, like this next move, right? The same guide of the Kingdom of France was assumed by another, actually a cousin of Charles IV, Philip VI, that started the Valois dynasty, which was technically the same Capetians. Telling you, we distinguish Capetians and Valois, but Valois are Capetians, in fact. Even the Bourbon are Capetians, if you follow the line. That, however, namely as the Valois proper, were destined to govern France for about 2 centuries. There's the Valois Angoulême, the succession. But they were basically the same, all the same people, right? Even across the channel. Look at, Edward III Manor, right? That was, in fact, Charles IV's sister. So Edward III didn't give up these claims, and because mainly, actually, of attritions having to do with both the Guyenne, right, and the Aquitaine, and most especially, actually, the true casus belli was the war with Scotland. That the English had tried to extend their control over the area at the beginning of the 14th century. The Scots had basically won their independence, but the wars continued. In these times, there are some of the most important battles fought in medieval history. Think about Neville's Cross, previously the same Bannockburn, and we'll have to see them in detail, a video per each at least. And we already made a video on the Battle of Stirling Bridge at the end of the 13th century, but just for saying. And the French intervention definitely, in this situation for which the English basically were trying to strengthen their ties with Aquitaine, that historically speaking had never been particularly fond of the French, and that shared definitely, as Occitania is a very different culture in many ways, and also the contacts with Flanders, because now the French fleets basically threatened the same English communication and trade with this land. So the problem was very serious, and the same French interference with the war with Scotland that was allied of the Kingdom of France for basically most of the 100 Years' War, and historically speaking, so even during the modern age, brought Edward, that had managed to defeat the same Scots in battle, to invade France, right? And this is how probably the military, the beginning of the 100 Years' War, as we mean it historiographically speaking. There were some major naval operations. Think about the Battle of Sluis. For a while, basically, the English managed to wipe out the French fleet, to raid, to destroy, to raid undisturbed most of the channel, and mostly actually preventing a French naval invasion of England that was already, had already been attempted actually in the past, and it was a concrete thing. And with the support of the Flemish, that actually were supporting at that point the succession of Edward III on the French throne as French subjects, because this is the whole deal, the dynastic thing, that the same Flemish, of course, they weren't idiots. They perfectly knew what they were doing. They were saying, look, we don't obey to Philip the Sixth because the true king is the true French king is Edward III, and we want to be his subjects. We must be by right his subjects. So now today we will not enter into details of the military history of the world. Naturally, you know that this is mostly a military history based channel, so it's useless to talk here about Crécy in detail. But I assume you know what we're talking about. Assume that you understand the importance of Edward III. We made a video actually about him recently. I don't remember how it's called, but it figures in the thumbnail as the sarcophagus of Edward III himself. That actually praises exactly his work, aside from a military point of view, but probably from a political and social point of view. That is the English army that manages to defeat repeatedly enormous armies that in history, like if you're really searching for the strongest army in history, that on the base of the, let's say, on the criterion of the conditions of symmetry, material culture, let's say, France and England are identical. Like, it's not that they are two different civilizations; they're the same, like, at identical level. There is no army in the annals of military history ever. Right? Don't talk me about the Romans, that you know how much I love them or whatever. This is pure mathematics, right? It is essentially knowing that no country, no army in history defeated repeatedly enemy armies with such a degree of numerical inferiority towards them in the history of mankind. Right? This is an astonishing result that cannot be explained through a tactical formula. Right? That I'm personally actually involved with my research in studying something that has also to do with properly the European armies at the beginning of 14th century and comparing it to the European perspective and how armies properly work, because I don't think we know cent for cent how the thing was. It was particularly explored in a truly European dimension. What we need at this time in history is especially in Europe, is to start reasoning as true Europeans, right, and throwing away this trash of nationalism that has destroyed the truest meaning of Europe, that was the pre-French Revolutionary one, truly, right? People who are, nationalistic and nostalgic of, medieval times, are schizophrenic people. I mean, fundamentally they're radically ignorant by definition, but in fact they don't even understand what they're thinking. They're trying to collect the legacy of by essentially embracing nationalism, which is the denial of the ancien regime and all the values that inspired this very realities, their communities, their true beliefs. But there is no need to expand on this. But just I don't even remember why I got there. But the point I was making is that the fact of the English armies here, it's, please, don't start. It's not the longbow, okay? The longbow is a mean to an end, all right? And the system itself is the victorious element as a whole, right? The longbow by itself is zero, right? Like every weapon, right? Doctrine is everything. Technology is nothing, right? And this is the reality of military history. That if you want to accept it, we said it many times, fine. If you don't want, fine. But just be aware that on Schwerpunkt, this is how we teach military history, and on a Clausewitzian base, so not really on the first delusion you can read on the internet. And this is in fact what Edward III manages to create properly for the English kingdom and with the English kingdom. The English kingdom actually was very well organized, in spite of the civil wars of the defeats, etc. Undergone under the centuries. It was a solid, robust thing. It was a relatively well centralized already by that time. Surely well organized. There is definitely a continuity also in its military culture and tradition. It was more unitary than the one of France in many ways, even to the details. This is what, it's a continuity in English history that, I don't know, went on even later on. If you think about, as a country of old industrialization, this, terrific organization was displayed, I don't know, during the Battle of Britain, etc. That's a real thing. It has to do with the historical tradition of the English monarchy per se, and the English people together, because this is really the formula. This is what is being stressed, in my opinion, very, very cleverly during the 800 years anniversary of the Magna Carta 5 years ago, by most of, at least, the public figures of, the historians, mostly British historians, talked about it, that this exactly this dialectic between all the various community of the kingdom, that is a path of civilization, right? We wouldn't know whether it would have been better for England to have won the Battle of Bouvines on the long run. We can't say that. History is not deterministically explainable. But indeed, what was created was, on the long run, a balanced system that did create problems to the monarchy per se, but in some ways managed the kingdom to remain together. But definitely, and even here, that would have not been enough hadn't there been major figures like Edward III himself. The fact he basically wiped out all his father's, protege that were having a negative political influence, that he managed to reshape, to give a robust structure to the kingdom's organization, properly in a military sense. The English begin to pierce this giant of France that is facing at the time, together with basically all of Europe, England included, Britain included, overall, with the great crisis of the 14th century. Seemingly the environment began to cool down. The major financial failures, of which England in part was, let's say, not responsible, but definitely involved in. All the Italian loans that also financed the same beginning of the 100 Years' War. The collapse of this major financial companies throughout Europe, the contraction of agricultural production, major disasters, the climate went crazy at some point. The plague would arrive, of course, in the mid of the century, but the system was already shattered, entering recession, demographic contraction, social inequality stratification. I mean, the thing really, in part, it actually favored the same process of centralization and territorialization of power, because the signories and the principalities managed to wear out in a way, or at least to stand surviving over the masses of the commoners that actually in the first half of the century had on riding the wave of the huge 13th century expansion, had managed to arrive to do things like the Flemish at Courtrai, the fitting with an army of only infantry, to the flower French of European cavalry, right? The strongest cavalry ever, the French one, that, as we'll see, as you know perfectly well, was the protagonist of so many defeats during the same 100 Years' War, but not because of a missed tactical form, right? I must say, I've been reading consistently about this stuff, and the impression I got is that you can't explain the military history, the tactical history, let's say, of the 100 Years' War by pretending literally that the French were a bunch of the French noblemen, the French cavalry were a bunch of arrogant and careless fanatics that simply said, "Oh, look at these commoners, let's simply throw ourselves over and over again against them, even if we die all the time." Right? This is not reality. This is not reality, and no, it's not reality even if you study those battles, right? If you actually look at the sources and say, what the hell does this mean, and what the hell do we actually know about what happened? Do you think we actually know what happened in battles like Crécy or Poitiers or Azincourt? We don't know. Not even the authors that were eyewitness of the battle actually knew what the hell happened in there. And therefore, I don't think it's very prudent to go tell, from 2020 to our 14th century French noble knight, what his craft had to be, right? By sitting lazily, eating chips and spending, wasting life over in front of a screen of a smartphone, right? This is not wise, right? And it doesn't prove that, you're intelligent if you point out that, look at this stupid aristocratic fanatics. No, because believe me, you would have not been able to do better than them. Because there is a context. There's not just a battlefield that you say, okay, well, now it's just a battle. There's a reality that even if you understand it from a strategical point of view, it already changes the equation. People just analyze the tactic, think it's a mechanic thing that happens, replicated, infinitely, just because there is one genius that one day instead wakes up and changes it eventually, right? It doesn't work like that. But aside from this is my usual rants about the topic. This is the point I'm making. Without the English state that Edward III created, men-at-arms and longbowmen would have not defeated French cavalry in the field. Even the same English one, but anybody's, right? And that's the reason why the same French kept fighting the way they did, and why, after all, that wasn't a bad idea at all, right? And but aside, I have all my ideas, and here I will have to explain it one day. This is not the right. Maybe this would be the right video, but I would like to keep it more general, right? But it's, as we were saying before, with Edward III's landing in France that began properly the first war, at least, of this larger conflict, over this larger ensemble that lasted for more than 1 century, and that for the it's a very reason we call it the 100 Years' War. As we were saying before, the dynastic crisis was in reality just one of the many causes that brought Edward III to declare war to the Kingdom of France, right? There is properly no intention here of conquering the Kingdom of France, right? That was unthinkable, right? The idea is, what was the 100 Years' War strategically speaking? It was literally about a dynastic substitution. I mean, that's the gerade genug. There was no idea, let's say, okay, like now England with its manpower will invade France. It was impossible, right? There were much more attainable results, right, that consisted, methodologically speaking, from a broader strategical point of view, to maintain, first of all, its domains in France, right, and that was mostly about Aquitaine that had been passed once again to them. It was as we were saying before, an area that had never looked favorably upon the French expansion on its territory. Was technically part of the Kingdom of France since Carolingian times, and it was a florid area, right? It was the Guyenne, and there were major cities. Think about Bordeaux was not much less populated than London. It was a very fertile area, very well administrated. Even the properly, here Guyenne and Aquitaine are often associated, but Aquitaine is a much larger area. This is the one that the English actually came to ride, because it was in the outer part, in the continental part, or also from the Mediterranean watershed, properly from the Guyenne. And in a phase in which that is complex, because these areas were naturally more difficult to control from the north of France. The Rhone Valley, that I don't think it was, I don't remember, at least there were raids in there. Surely something happened here and there, because many powers took part of the war. Think about Savoy, think about there's all the Iberian front that is often underappreciated. But let's say this was a major conflict that involved many other powers, foreign powers, and that actually was intertwined with the same this other external conflict. So it's very complicated. But the point I was making is that these southern areas were ravaged in a moment of broader collapse of the local public control, of a general major shift in trade. Like the 100 Years' War was in part cause and consequence of the shift of major trade routes, especially from Italy. That this moment in which the affairs of Champagne and of the disappear. First of all, because the French raised this were war zones very often, but also because basically the ports of Provence fell out of importance. The Italians shifted their trade routes. The Rhone Valley mostly imported a lot of stuff from the south, from Tuscany, from up to the north. There was major north-south axis. The Genoese instead start now circumnavigating Spain and going to Flanders and England from there. The Venetians also take the German route. So there is a different branching of this major trade routes, and there is a major collapse even of the financial capabilities of the French kingdom. That is naturally mostly due to the clamorous defeats, mostly in fact Crécy, Poitiers, and Azincourt. The second one seeing the capture of John II of France himself. The French king was captured and ransomed with £3 million, something like that, and he was very seen. The other years were seen as an age of chivalry. In many ways, it's already beyond that, but the formalities were still important for the French king. His son managed to escape from prison after the battle, and therefore he felt committed to once he had come back to go back in exile, in prison to England, where he actually, I don't remember where he was in England, but yeah, I think so, where he died. But you understand here, there is this back and forth of the English possessions. Normandy is re-seized with the Treaty of Bretigny. Other lands too, and the Guyenne that remains as an important chunk. So there is really a fragmentation of the same French territorial unity under the war. This means less incomes, tax collections, tolls, things like these, and less, especially interconnection. Much of those times trades on a large scale was based on the idea is that not just there must be a connection between two areas, but these two areas must be pacified. They don't have to be interfered like with war. Look at the English chevauchée in France, right? So these massively devastating and deep raids that were launched in most of France, actually, and that disrupted this unity, so that there was an internal contraction, really, to make the French crown lose control on the incomes and growing weaker and weaker. As we know, Paris will fall, right? Also, thanks, in fact, to the break of the French monarchy between the Armagnac and the Bourguignons, that were respectively like the French royal loyalists, let's say it in this way. There is much more than that. There is also probably a French court and bureaucracy that stands, in terms of political and social interests with the crown, and there is the Parisian bourgeoisie that basically betrays the king and allies with Burgundian dukes that are building a fortune, at least in the east, across the France and the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, it's not complicated. You know these stories, I presume, pretty well by yourself, so we don't need to repeat it, like at the detail, right? But as we were saying at the beginning, the major element of contrast was actually Flanders, right? Flanders were basically the most the richest region of Europe, second to Italy, and that had a lot in common actually, because it was all city-states, and there were formally, as we've seen under the French king, and this area was very important because it, given that Normandy came back in the hands of the English, it was also one of the few areas the French could even just access the sea, and the most important aspect was mainly financial. Like, it was a strategic, for the Flanders were a strategic region for the trade of English wool that was at the time under the French control, and that had triggered the same English intervention in that regard, because a consolidation of the French control on Flemish markets would have basically kept most of the English economy. It was largely based on wool exports in a trade perspective. Would have been, simply controlled by there. And so, as we were saying before, starting from Flanders, the English king managed to exploit at its best, really, the qualities of its army. based conceptually on infantry since the times of the defeat of Edward II's father. Was this idea of kind of it was to fight. The fight was better dismounted, even for the knights, etc. This is interesting because actually English armies were mostly mounted, right? These troops dismounted just for the major pitched battles. Part of the reason being probably the overwhelming superiority of the enemy numbers that brought to defense, and you can't defend on horseback. By definition, cavalry defends only when it dismounts, and that's not cavalry anymore. So that's also part of the reason. For the rest, all the men-at-arms and even the longbowmen were mostly mounted. There was also an innovative use of firearms that, maybe at the time of Edward III were not this still major factor in the field. Definitely, it was growing in importance, right? And especially in siege warfare, starting to make the difference. On the long run, actually, artillery would favor the French that had actually the larger assets at some point. And even though Burgundy had developed slightly before and more than the same French, that's another story. And this combination, however, managed to defeat the somewhat slower, more predictable French army that was based on heavy cavalry. But the point in here is that there was nothing anachronistic about it, right? You often read things like that, the 100 Years' War brought to an end of chivalry, or of, this broader importance of cavalry. This is actually not true, right? This is it's actually complicated to explain, because the English armies are some of the protagonists of the infantry victories of the early 14th century, but they have properly nothing popular in it, right? It's not like the Flemish or the Swiss or the Ditmarsha or even the Scots that fought in that way, because that's literally what they had. Like the English formula is doctrinary. We can say basically without anachronism in this regard. And as we were saying before, actually the French power, was French might was enough. Like if you take the Battle of Azincourt, for example, hadn't just had the terrain had been different, had other factors gone, there was no. It's not that the English won hands down, right? They had to struggle for it, and it was not certain. It was no full certainty of it, and it's the same, but not even the slightest in some measure, as always. And we must see this repeated English victories definitely not as a coincidence, but understanding also the true value of them on the basis of the fact they were not granted at all in that specific context, not in the context of I have an army that is composed in a way, the enemy has an army that is composed in the other, but in the very battles, right? But I hope, one of my plans is to really start, I've studied the Battle of Formigny, which, for example, French cavalry actually broke through the English lines at some point. It's a complex battle, peculiar situation. It's the last major encounter before Châtillon. But aside from this, the point here is that there are lots of different clashes that we have to observe and to see how every single one was different, and that there is a recurring pattern, but it's not always the same thing. There are interesting details I would like to add, but okay, I promise I'll stop here. So this first phase of the clash, let's say under Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, etc., was concluded in a disastrous way for the French that lost enormous and important territories, especially in the southwestern side of their country. The English conquests, however, were fundamentally ephemeral, because the sovereigns during the second half of the 14th century had to concentrate their effort on the long run within England herself, where very serious social upheavals had broke out, and that was tied, not surprisingly, to the harshening of taxes aimed at financing the military expenses. Now this is interesting because, of course, even yeah, the English managed to win a lot of stuff, and big time. But even in the same end of Edward III's reign, that eventually died more or less in the time of his son, the point, the situation was not easy. Like the great chevauchées were launched. Think about the ones in southern, led by the Black Prince in Aquitaine. In fact, it was devastating when it passed from Carcassonne, all those areas, that destroyed actually a very well built countryside. The same English sources say that were aimed actually at compensating the very serious financial problems due to the Black Death that had broke out everywhere in England as well, in France, and that was literally, I mean, resources were running out. So even if the English obtain all these successes, actually from their perspective is that the kingdom is struggling to stay afloat, right? That's why before we said, it doesn't suffice to have the Magna Carta to have this thing lasting. The England by that time could have simply crumbled, turned itself apart. Maybe, I don't know, the monarchy would have remained. Maybe a lot of other things would have happened, but don't think it. Even in there, it's to be given for the thing is the unity of the kingdom is to be given for granted, especially after the potential defeats. I mean, imagine if just they had lost at Crécy or any other major battle of the war, what would have happened in England, right? And look at what would have basically happened in after the 100 Years' War, just after 2 years, and that's another story, because the War of the Roses is also very peculiar, set conflict, broadly speaking, because that's also what a set of wars basically. But it was very, very different from the one fought in France. The point, though, I'm making here is that that's literally what that state I was talking to you about before, let's say, refounded by Edward III, allowed not just his victories, but the English system to remain standing in this time. So we're harsh for everybody, right? That brought to these major revolts that broke out a bit all over Europe. In France, you have the Jacquerie, and it was actually a mass rebellion in some of the most productive areas of of France herself, that were based on the fact that the English were raiding the territory that the French king had no capacity basically to stem these raids at some point, and therefore the local communities rebelled, backed actually by those who were interested in this kind of fluid, unstable situation in France herself, including the Parisian bourgeoisie. Right, the idea of being in a centralized position from a strong England and a kind of a weak France was very advantageous for the merchants, the great merchants of Paris, etc. This is interesting because it shows, we made videos about that actually. Made a lot of videos. I mean, a decent amount of videos on the peasant revolts, and we have observed even in there how the peasants never quite, like historically speaking, all the great mass revolutions haven't started really truly from the bottom. It's always been a middle class that guided them, right? A bit about intelligence. This is true for this case, for the French Revolution, for the Russian Revolution. It's never like the illiterate doesn't quite know what he's doing. This is just radical violence of the lower strata of the population that was curbed eventually. I mean, revolution did not happen in France in the 14th century, simply because these peasantry was, on the long run, not enough organized and driven by art. This is a nutshell the history of medieval peasantry towards, in fact, this 14th century. That is the moment in which in basically all countries, like from France, England, Germany, Italy, these revolts went on, whether they were in the countryside or in the salaried workers of the textile industries. In these areas, we're entering a crisis, as we've seen, like Flanders, Italy had major crisis in this regard. It was the international situation was contracted. It's probably the financial element that decreases, and the land that actually increases. I mean, comes back on the force. It had always been it, but at least more importantly again, as an investment. And yet the French nobility manages to to actually exterminate all the rebellions, the rebels, and to crush this all, right? But the potential of the same mass mobilized was really dangerous, could really subvert the order, right? France is historically this huge system. I mean, France risked revolution even up to the 1970s. Like, it was a moment of, it's such a large system in which masses also, politically speaking, tend to shift quite easily, right? Big systems create big imbalances, right? And this also, to greater benefit, in the sense that, France is a solid state, historically speaking, dating back exactly to this moments and before, on the long run. And still at this point, we see, in fact, that the establishment manages to maintain its own control over the situation. And the English cannot do more than much. They have dramatically less resources than the French. Their objective is properly to overthrow the ruling dynasty and to be instated on the throne by other, rival dynasties of the factions, let's say, of the main one, and other supporters, and they come pretty close to that, right? There is the revival of the clashes between France and England at the beginning of the 15th century, right? There was always back and forth. There is all a chapter here should be open about mercenarism, about the great companies, or even single great figures, great entrepreneurs of war. Think about Guesclin, the Black Dog of, as the English called him. He was a Breton, often said like he was illiterate. Actually, that's a bit of a myth. He was a Breton. He came from a relatively modest, humble background. He was one of the greatest commanders, inflicting important setbacks to the English at the end of the 14th century, and managing to revert, to actually end properly the first phase of the war. So it was all a moment also of bands. At some point after the war, at this point armies were normally recruited ad hoc, they were employed for a certain amount of time, then they were disbanded. Disbanded meant that actually the units remained in place, and they went roaming around the country, right? And this was a big deal, and it was part of the reason why towards the end of the war there is the creation of more permanent forces that literally began as early as the 1350s in France, that had still more resources to do so compared to England. That consisted, it's often said, this is the beginning of permanent armies, right? Because modernists especially are obsessed by the idea of the thing began for the first time, like there is a modern age after, and before there is a middle age. No, like permanent armies have kind of always existed by some number, right? Maybe not armies in the sense of the range of the thousands, but still, how permanent do they have to be? Like, there is a continuity indeed in the maintenance of troops even after the war was over. This combat-ready force that could be reemployed and was starting to be tied, clientelarly speaking, to the monarchy, to be starting, to be quartered in some areas. There is this process of increased centralization and a true degree of permanence that begins at this time in France, from France. And this starts naturally, the French on the long run are the ones that make the greater efforts after all. Like this would be interesting to explain from the English side, at least considering what the crisis that, the defeat in the war brought eventually to the English, and it would be interesting to study the continuity of military institutions. The one that actually makes it is France. It's France that begins and to be properly a modern power, while England would take a long time before it. You have to wait the revolutions of the 17th century before you start finding something comparable to what started happening since the late Middle Ages and the early modern age in countries like France or Spain, etc., in terms of permanent armies in this regard. But once again, England is England. It's not France. It has different, less resources. It's different characteristics, and politics and society change everything. But aside from this, it's important to see how the resilience of France in the end, right? The idea that this system, as mastodontic and weak and exposed and vulnerable in a way, and considering also all the blows that it got, managed, however, to maintain a degree of unity, right? The new clash, as we have seen, started at the beginning of the 15th century, triggered by a dynastic crisis caused by the illness that had struck the King of France, Charles VI. He basically went nuts, and this brought to impeded him to govern. It happened all of a sudden, apparently, and therefore, how it had happened in the previous century, the English repeated their invasion. They obtained important victories, and they managed to, astonishingly, conquer a great part of northwestern France, Paris included. Right? They weren't alone. They did it thanks to the Burgundians as well. Actually, they were the ones that seized Paris proper. At this point, there is all the. Once again, we're brutally concise in this regard, but that's where we get to the mythology of Jeanne d'Arc. Now, there's another way of putting it like this: this young peasant girl, originally from Lorraine. That here there's all a symbolism that was eventually reshaped by nationalism, by all the this historiographical readaptations of the thing, and we can't obviously be to believe the romantic myth of Jeanne d'Arc in a strictly military sense, but we can do it politically already at the point of realizing that she managed to channel, at least to catalyze through her visionary religiosity and definitely a strong loyalism towards the Kingdom of France, the popular commitment, right, in the clash against the English armies. And this is interesting because, as we've seen before, France had been ravaged. She was a peasant herself. The majority of those who had been killed and destroyed by this war was the peasantry. We've seen how brutally had been repressed, actually by the same French establishment because of the threat they posed. But that's probably the point in which these communities were brought with shoulders against the wall. Like what are you doing now from this point onwards? Right, it's not going to be better. Right, the world situation calls for stability. The English Kingdom of Kingdom of France, let's call it this way, would have not necessarily given that. It would have been a time of further uncertainty, of problems. These areas would have been dealt with like lands of conquest, at least more than how England was dealt with. This is how the English nobility was starting to see France after all. Right, there is the idea here that on the long run, the same lands that had historically been under the English, for at least for a while, for example Normandy, now didn't quite like the English anymore. Right, the first English king literally came from the first French king of England, let's put it in this way, came from Normandy. But this kind of national character of the clash now was taking a new interesting shape. The English nobility had its own, land now in France, but it had been basically retaken after a very long time of English exclusion from France. Right? These were now something different. They were occupants, and what actually it's interesting to point out here is how the English were backed mostly by the urban classes of the major French cities, in especially as we've seen in Aquitaine, in part in Normandy as well, and in Flanders, and even by the same Paris at a certain point. But the peasantry, right, the most common people you could find out there, Jacques Bonhomme, as they were called stereotypically in France, didn't see these people as someone who could make a deal with, right? This whole conflict is intertwined with the with the contrast that comes to be acquired also between the city and the countryside after the crisis of the mid-14th century. The idea that it's the same rich bourgeoisie of the city that takes over the countryside after a time in which the situation had been relatively more balanced, right? The French kings had sometimes, of course, the French nobility thought the peasants were subhumans, pieces of trash. Like, let's be honest about this. The medieval chivalry is based on the concept of a sort of proto-rational superiority compared to the lower social classes. Like, the peasant is a half a beast in the this is what is interesting, not just in the nobility view, but also in the patriciate of the cities. Right, there is a kind of courtly feudal-like and urban culture at the same time. It now is mingling at the vertex of society, but still, for the sake at least of France, French politics, French kings had understood at this point the importance of the peasantry, of the properly of the mass of the French population and its agricultural resources and potential in being able to overthrow the opponent in a way that now had come to be, maybe more evident than before, that probably had always existed. The French at the beginning of the war probably, counted to resolve the thing in a different way, but now the situation was disastrous. Like, the only city that the French crown now held was Orléans. Having fallen that, the Valois were over, and therefore Jeanne of Arc resistance and this idea of saying, we are French, we are part of this overall system. It doesn't matter how, that the world is upside down, a certain default, but are we letting the English fundamentally siding with these wealthy merchants that care only about exploiting our work and so on, of the countryside and so on, and give up our God-given king, right, of France and all of its mystics, and this is what Jeanne of Arc really embodies, historically speaking, and I think it's real. Like, I'm no one to say whether this was decisive or not, probably wasn't, but it definitely catalyzed, as we were saying before, a sentiment that was emerging in a proto-national sense in France as a broader community of a broader group of communities that had, after all, something in common, that after all, accepted the idea of an established order where the king the monarchy could deliver this stability and control of the area that equated to not dying butchered by a ravaging English mercenary or some other nationality, because here basically all the scum of Europe was coming to raid as like a big party after all, and or to die, to starve to death because our country is devastated, there is nothing to grow anymore. Right, this is an important factor that must be recognized for the final French victory. It naturally has much more to do in general with lots of other things together, including, first of all, the sheer, of course, political and military events, the importance of the monarchy, its organization, its ties, its interests, even the participation of other countries in a way, not so much, but mostly an internal thing. It was mostly a domestic thing. And Jeanne d'Arc, at the head of some French military contingents, first of all managed to free the city of Orléans from the English siege that You know, the English were good at their job. They knew how to fight wars just like the French and anybody else who was ruling Europe at that time. So this English defeats on the long run must not be seen as now that the French peasant arrived and inspired everybody and the evil English began to fall. No, that's obviously not the case. That's why I was emphasizing, in fact, there's much more than that to that. But it's undeniable, at least, that from 1429 and the let's say the freeing of Orléans led to this was considered as the beginning of the comeback of the Valois. That was started being followed by important victories. Now the destiny of Jeanne was, as you know, was terrible and vicious. She was captured by the Burgundians at the siege of Compiègne. She was partly like the Charles VII, the new king of France, had, of course, cited her, but at this point, after her capture, it's as if the monarchy forgot about her. And the Burgundians, the Dukes of Burgundy, gave her to the English, their allies, and they condemned her for witchcraft by an ecclesiastical tribunal. She died in 1431, burnt at the stake, right, alive, in Rouen in Normandy. If you go to the city, it is beautiful. You can still find the spot where she died. It's terrible if you think about it, and really, naturally, as I think as Europeans, as Westerners in general, we have embraced, and I can't speak for the English, which I obviously am not. I mean, if anything, linguistically, it's pretty clear. But we have embraced, the romantic myth of Jeanne, and she definitely represents something more after all. The resistance towards the invader, the idea of a national, pro-national sentiment among the masses. This idea that her sacrifice ultimately brought to the victory in the end, all clothed with a religious symbolism, etc. It's all very interesting. Now we could talk more about her, but maybe we'll make a dedicated video on the topic. But this is really the turn of the tides, because the war basically went gradually always in favor of the French. Like, we did a series of important victories. The King of France, Charles VII, managed to bring an end to not just to the war, but to the conflict itself. Right, the English suffered several defeats. The French army at this point gained steam. The English kingdom didn't manage to counter the sheer mass at this point of the compacted French forces under the guidance of their king, and the picture definitely came to an end. Also, we're talking before about the importance of artillery. Then in siege warfare, now the English came to the strategic defensive. So they started losing fortress after fortress in France, and that's what in spite of the same rise of firearms, that the main strategic deal really was. And by 1453, the English remained just with the city of Calais in France, and the two kingdoms, therefore, that would remain, as you know, in English hands up to the 1558, and it was taken actually with a very rapid action because it was unguarded. Actually, England didn't give up the rights on the French throne up to 1803, right, where the Bourbons were exiled in England after the French Revolution, and that reveals probably how deep, and now there's a trait in here probably of dynastic scale that we can't fully understand as moderns. The importance here of still an aristocratic and chivalric war. It's useless, in my opinion, to say, this war showed the rise of democratization of warfare. Frankly, this is not true, because the world pattern of European history, it's not that. You know, seeing infantry on the field has very few to do with democracy. The armies of the infantry armies of the Flemish or you know or the Swiss in the first half of 14th century had perhaps more to do with democracy than the you know the armies of pikemen of the second half of the 15th century. Those were, you know, the first were free commoners taking sword in hand and saying, you know, we want to be free and don't bother. The second were military, they were mercenaries, they were soldiers hired by princes with their money, and that's pretty much it. And they didn't do anything, you know, for their own sake. So where's the democratization of warfare? I really don't see it. Even the same spread of firearms doesn't quite bring to that, right? Armies of people are yet to be seen in historically, as we mean it from the French Revolution, with nationalism, with the nation state proper. I don't look much of the 100 Years' War as a, you know, democratizing phenomenon, but rather, if anything, of the strengthening of a monarchic model. Because the Kingdom of France became a hell of a freaking monster once again, like it had been at the beginning of the 14th century. It began to reinvade the war. Think about the wars of Italy, the prolonged struggle with the Habsburgs. And later on, yeah, it's engulfed once again by a major clash that has to do with some, in many ways, there is a recurrence in French history, the wars of religion, etc. Then, under Louis XIV, it really begins to be something more, something mighty and enormous once again, so that all of Europe has to come to counter it once again. But this character you find maybe in even popular sites, you know, the democracy of the footman is very, very, very relative, right? In strictly political terms, because, you know, how are you judging these armies? I mean, literally by the numbers of infantrymen. You know, you should judge armies from the political and social background, and if you look at that, it's so evident that was actually, since properly the moments of the 100 Years' War, sort of refeudalization of warfare, right? Compared to the beginnings of the 14th century, indeed. But even compared to the 13th century, after all, in parallel to the development of same feudalism. No, I will not spend much time for explaining now this opinion, but I guess if you follow Schwerpunkt regularly, you know what we're talking about. I would conclude this video by pointing out, you know, an aspect that we have already touched, but that we may have to define better. I'll say that the two kingdoms of England and France assumed after the 100 Years' War the physiognomy that would have characterized them for centuries, right? And not just from a territorial point of view, right? Because the unity of France was never more, you know, destroyed as such, right? This strifes that we remember also during the modern age never made coming to an end the idea of a monarchy, after all. And it not even under the 100 Years' War, but from the dynastic and institutional principle, but at least during the 100 Years' War, it was literally possible for these local communities to, especially at the periphery of the kingdom, to start re-emerging as something else, right? As something politically autonomous. From the second half of the 15th century, the French victory in the 100 Years' War brought to a dramatic empowering of the political and administrative structures of the French kingdom, right? There was probably an institutionalization of many communities, including the cities that had been, as we have seen, so important and treacherous and somewhat even, you know, unruly later on in the French, you know, institutional system, that were now controlled firmly by the same French monarchy as that was growing within Paris finally as a full capital, as part of a proper structure now from which you couldn't fundamentally escape anymore. There will be a lot to talk about it, and we will probably do it, especially in the juridical history playlist. But it's important to to stress, for example, also the importance of the parliaments, of the participation of various communities to the kingdom. The peasantry lost this opportunity, for example, on the long run, but at least France became now a stable system that, in spite of all the difficulties that would surely arise, that was never broken in its concrete. England, as you know, entered into this 30 Years' War of 1455-85, known as the Wars of the Roses, that in many ways was the direct consequence of the loss of the French territories by the English nobility, that not knowing where to vent their, predatory and devastatory desires, from which they sustained themselves. And it had been a thing. I mean, the chevauchés in France during the 100 Years' War were highly lucrative business in that regard. Thought well to start, killing each other. And this paradoxically, on the long run, brought to a stabilization, say, in English monarchy, and the rise of the Tudor the beginning of the Tudor era, because basically the House of Lords was, decimated. The kingdom didn't suffer particularly, like the wars of the campaigns and battles of the Wars of the Roses. We'll have to make a video about that. Were they were not disruptive, right? They were small armies fought by small armies, and that were essentially intention not at destroying the local countryside, generally speaking, which still happened in some way, of course, but mostly killing the other noblemen that, for dynastic reason, could now, cut a line and therefore make enormous, assets passing the hands of others. And that's largely how, even the Kingdom of England managed to survive and to absorb the heavy blow of the 100 Years' War. And England, in this regard, loses in many ways the opportunity of modernizing, because while France really transformed the most updated statal system in Europe, literally shortly afterwards the war, they started receiving all the Artois, all the regions they had lost. They crushed the Burgundians, they reabsorb everything. I mean, they become something really big that manages to make a tabula rasa and rebuild from scratch in many cases. England, in a way, implodes on itself. And if you look at its history during this century, there would be further attempts of invasion of France later on in the 80s. There would be, there's always this obvious instability for those times and places and mechanisms, right? But on the long run, especially during the early modern age, England, at least up to the mid-16th century, it was still updated for continental standards. Even in warfare, still a longbow had a thing to say, after all. Up to Henry VIII, let's say, the English army and state was functional. Even the confiscation of the monasteries, I mean, the wealth was gotten from somewhere. From the second half of the 16th century, things started going rough, right? England hadn't much of horses or metals. They had to import artillery, cavalry, all this stuff. They started becoming obsolete. It's not, up to the English, the new model army that England will have a true, updated army once again compared to continentals, and that's wholly another story. But it starts, if you want, from a crisis of a system that had lagged behind since the times of the 100 Years' War, in many ways. And yet, this had consolidated within itself, like probably the Kingdom of England now had regained, more clearly defined national identity that rejected even the French element that had existed since centuries, in the very ruling class, actually. And that instead gave itself a truly more English character, and this is definitely also important. There would be too much to add for a single video, but I think we have to stop here. But I would like to leave you with this broader reflection of how many things actually the 100 Years' War touched in European history, and how there is probably a local, national, a continental dimension to be taken in consideration. It would be very interesting to study just what was happening in France during the war compared to places like, I don't know, Spain, Germany, Italy. Think about all the English veterans that were discharged after the Treaty of Bretigny, went fighting in Italy, creating a sort of semi-nomadic, mercenary state, selling its services here and there, with longbows, with that, by the way, were a product actually even in there. I mean, not longbows, but the think about John Oakwood. I'm talking about his company, White Company. Excuse me. Of the same organizational models had been conferred to the English army by Edward III, and there is a reason if that was the single most successful mercenary company of the period. So yeah, we have really to start making a lot of videos about all of these things, and at some point we will hopefully do. Naturally, there is much to cover, but I presume that we can't wait at least a bit. Maybe it will happen next day. I mean, it really depends on my topics choice, really not. But it's still to do with the interest we have, because these topics are overlooked. I believe mostly the English audience surely knows what I'm talking about, broadly speaking, but I think in popular culture, in most countries in general, there is not even an idea that this is a thing and it has properly a European dimension, and that what we study in this war has really had dramatic impact on all over history, all over the world, after all. But in any case, for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.